It was Aza, a great day in the history of Omuaran Kingdom, usually celebrated every 6 months of the year. It was a day chosen for palace and market women to come together and appreciate their gods for having treated them well and protected them from the hands of their enemies, who would have stopped at nothing to destroy them. During Aza, they would always dance round the village and gather in the palace with various gifts for the king, chief priests, and their gods. But that year, they didn't. The people were not happy about how the gods had kept quiet and had not given them reply to their request of a king. They felt vulnerable and weak, as their enemies could use that against them when strategizing another war. They knew war was not always far-fetched from them because people saw them as a threat, being the largest community amongst the ones around them and the ones with the greatest gods, who was said to have burnt a whole village within a day. The people's complaints had got to the ears of the chiefs, and they called for a meeting with the chief priest to see how they can appease the gods to stop being quiet and choose a king for them already. They gathered as planned and headed straight to the shrine where the chief priest lived. The chief priest did some consultations, and he said that the gods knew their petitions and was now ready to answer them. They jumped for joy and asked for the next step, as they prayed in their minds that the gods made their choice that day, seeing that the whole village were already waiting for them in the palace. The chief priest, after consulting the gods, decided to follow the chiefs to the palace to make the selection process easy and done in the presence of everyone. They waited a while for the chief priest to get himself ready for the long journey because the shrine was very far from the village central. He packed all he wanted to pack, and they all started their journey. People were trooping inside the palace, having their seats in order of arrival and waiting for the long-awaited Aza meeting to start. They were all looking sad and curious as to what was keeping the chiefs late. They murmured and discussed in twos and threes the possibility of the neighboring kingdom warring against them anytime soon, and how they had no king to stand in their defense together with the other warriors. They had been dragging a piece of land with them for a long time now. This other village had claimed the land was their forefathers, and Omuaran people didn't want to let go. They resorted to fighting for it and agreed that the winner of the battle would become the rightful owner of the land. After a while, the chiefs marched in with the chief priest. The people at this point stopped talking and focused more on the reason the chief priest had come around for the Aza. They hardly saw the chief priest in the palace, so they wondered what had brought him down this time and prayed in their hearts that his coming would bring answers to their request for a king. One of the chiefs climbed what looked like a podium in front of the people to address them. He greeted them and welcomed them to a gathering that was supposed to be a celebration of protection, but was now a gathering of quest for a king. He explained that he and the rest chiefs had been on the search for a new king since the death of the previous king. He put their minds at rest and said their request had now been considered by the gods. Now the people had started gaining insight to the reason why the chief priest had come around for the Aza. He invited the chief priest out and left him to do the talking. Good day, everyone. I'm happy to announce to you that the gods are finally ready to appoint you a king. The chief priest said this with loudness and enthusiasm because he believed that was a great news to the people. He further said, I would want all family heads to wait while the rest of you go home. These ones, he pointed at the family heads who were already separating themselves from the people. They will give you feedbacks as soon as we are done here. The people though felt they should have been allowed to stick around rather than going home, but they went home knowing that the chief priest's instruction was in their best interest.
The chiefs waited till the crowd of people at the palace reduced, leaving the family heads alone with them. Then they tapped the chief priest to start the process already. They were very eager to know who their next king would be. The chief priest brought his cowries and started consulting the oracles, calling each family head's name as he did each of the consultations. He did this till he got to the last person, hoping that that would be the God's chosen one. He consulted the gods for the umpteenth time, but the answer was negative. He felt disappointed and stupid. He thought of why the gods would make him come all the way down to the palace to make fun of himself. He became a little afraid of what the chiefs would say if he told them the king was none of those ones there. He then thought of a solution. that if the gods had really told him their chosen king was one of the village family heads, and it was none of those present at the palace, then it would be that one of the family heads was absent from that meeting. He looked up and told the last family head standing in front of him while he consulted the gods that he wasn't the one. Everybody shouted in disbelief. But he calmed them with the revelation that someone was missing in that meeting and that that person might be the chosen one. Just as they were rumbling on who the person could be, a 40-year-old young man walked into the palace. He was the oldest in his family and had watched his father and uncles die years ago. He had been on the farm working since the day before that day and only left when he was done with his work. He remembered that day was Ava and decided to go to the palace. On his way home, he entered the palace, sat down. He wondered why the people in the palace were few, why the village women were not present. He concluded that they must have gone on a village errand, since that wouldn't be the first time.
Immediately he took his seat. The chief priest sighted him and called him forward. He consulted the gods with the hope that he would be the one. He seemed to be the last said person they were all thinking of going in search of before his arrival, so if he ended up not being the one, it would make everyone, including the priest, worked up. He prayed silently as he continued the consultation that this would not be one of times the gods would keep quiet and watch the villagers rain so all sort of unpleasant words on the hen. As he was about turning his face away from whatever he was doing to tell the people that the gods had given same reply as the others, he got a very bright signal on his consulting board, which was not only obvious to him but also to the rest of the house. He was so happy the gods didn't put him to shame and was now certain he heard rightly when the gods said to him that they were going to appoint a king that day. After they had all seen the bright light, they all stood up and bowed for this young man who was now their king to be. The chiefs were happy, as the chosen one seemed already rich and powerful. They would not need much work to be done on him when it comes to preparing him for the kingship title. They believed a poor king would depend so much on the people's proceeds to feed, and it would make life unbearable for the villagers. They closed the meeting and dispatched everyone to go spread the good news. As the coronation day drew closer, the whole village were excited and preparing for that day. Every day they brought yams, cassava flour, cassava flakes, plantains, animals and all sorts of things according to their level of blessings from the gods. They had divided themselves into groups and shared that day's work amongst themselves. The king-to-be, Obalola Adijari, had already left the village for fortification at the shrine. They had some rituals usually performed for everyone that was going to be king. This ritual was to fully make him lord over every living and non-living thing in the village and beyond. The rituals went on for 30 days. The villagers had hoped to see their king come out safe and sound, strong enough to be made king. The king himself was one who had already faced bigger challenges during his work as a farmer. He though wasn't the strongest and most powerful, but he wasn't easily scared of situations. He had eaten so many portions given to him by powerful men in their village and beyond. This was known to only him though, and that was why the villagers would even pray for someone like that to come back to them alive. They never knew he was stronger than they could ever think. Drummers were drumming, dancers were dancing, the village choristers were singing praises and the village women were seated, moving to the rhythm of the beats and songs being sung. They were smiling and exchanging pleasantries with one another while they patiently waited for the coronation ceremony to start in proper. The chiefs came out of the palace, greeted the people in unison and went ahead to have their seats. Now they were all waiting for the king's arrival with his bride, the one that was given him by one of the chiefs, when it was said by the chief priest that he needed a wife for the completion of the ritual process. He had no other option but to opt for the one given him by the kingmaker, Chief Durotola. They waited for a long time, but enjoyed every bit of the wait because it was for a good cause. Soon, the King Adebenja came out with his woman, who was traditionally legally married to him. He sat on the ancestral seat and had his wife sit by his right-hand side. He came out dressed in dynasty attire and his wife sparkling like royalty would sparkle. The villagers immediately rose to their feet and shouted,
Kabiyesi o! King Deja stretched forth his horsetail and shook it as a symbol that he was also greeting them. He started his statement by saying some words of prayers, which was culturally believed to have the immediate stamp of the gods of their land. Ilu Atoro, the king said, and the people replied, Ashe. The king continued to say these prayers till he exhausted all the prayers he could think of. At that point, he stretched forth his horse tail again and allowed the kingmaker, Chief Durotola, to do the next thing on that day's agenda. He stood up and called the priest to bless the crown and the beads as they were about to put it on King Deja's head. The chief priest blessed the crown, beads, and the staff of authority that was going to be given to the king. Kings, according to their culture, were said to be powerless without their staff of authority and wouldn't be able to carry out any royal assignment or command without the staff. After the aforementioned things had been blessed, Chief Durotola stepped forward to officially crown King Deja the king. The crown was carefully lifted and placed on his head. Next were the beads and his staff of authority, which were placed on him and handed over to him respectfully. The villagers couldn't even wait for the kingmaker to declare him officially a king before they rose to their feet and shouted, "Kabiyesi! May you live long on your father's throne. May your enemies all die. May your reign bring peace to us all. Ashe!" The king shook his horse tail again at the people, and merriment started. The dancers performed, and the singers sang songs to eulogize the king. The villagers left the palace that day, feeling happy and overwhelmed by the fact that they now had a king. King Deja, being a strong and courageous man who did whatever he was said to do at his slated time, took the coming war with their neighboring village upon himself, as he didn't want to disappoint the people or give them any reason to doubt his abilities to rule them. He called the warrior to the palace and had them fortified for the war. The warrior's head, Balogun, was so happy the king had shown interest in fighting this war with them, as no king had ever been so interested in following them to war. All they did was prepare the warriors only and give them whatever they needed to overcome the war. But this time it was different. King Deja prepared for the battle with them, as against his queen's warnings. He believed a king should be seen doing the toughest thing. Besides, he wasn't ready to sit back home and await the outcome his warriors would bring him in the palace. He wanted to be there and see things for himself. They girded themselves well with the help of the chief priest and was now set to go to the war front. They echoed, "You cannot, you cannot, you cannot take our land from us," repeatedly as they marched towards the battlefield. Looking at the total number of Omuaran warriors, one would say without mincing words that they would overcome their opponent. But things were no longer seen as the same when the opponent got to the battlefield too and were 2 times more in number than Omuaran warriors. They had heard of how undefeatable Omuaran had been for their predecessors, so they gathered so many warriors to defeat Omuaran. To be candid, Omuaran panicked and were thinking of the probability of being defeated for the very first time, seeing that their opponent was more than they were in number. But they couldn't show it, as it was already too late to go back to the village to fetch more warriors for that battle. King Deja looked at his warriors, signaled them to put their minds at rest, and swung his hands in a forward direction, which passed a message to half of the warriors to attack their opponent. Obatola watched his warriors struggle with their lives, and he immediately wished he hadn't followed them as the war continued in favor of Omuaran's opponent. Suddenly, a gun was shot at the king's direction, and all the warriors who stayed back with the king rushed to see how badly he was hurt.
King Deja found himself on the floor, holding his chest in disbelief that he was actually shot. He thought of many things he still wanted to do before dying. He thought of Queen's warnings and the fact he doesn't have a child yet. He started to regret ever following the warrior down there and wished to get just one more chance to live again. The warrior rallied round him to get off for quick first aid treatment, only to find out that the gunshot didn't hit him. It rather missed him to the next person who was a little far behind him. They checked King Deja's entire body to be sure he was fine, and then lifted him up to stand to his feet properly. No one knew he wasn't the one hurt. Even the king thought he was already dying. They rushed to the actual victim behind the king and tried to help him stay alive till the end of the battle. But it was too late because that warrior had died immediately he was shot. The gods must have saved the king from that gunshot, because the gunshot wasn't an ordinary one. It had been fortified to penetrate through the king's charms and kill him instantly. But the gods were solidly behind him and directed the gunshot to another place, which happened to be where that warrior was standing.
They had no time to mourn the dead, as the rest of the warriors were still fighting and struggling for their lives on the battlefield. They just spared that little minute to check their king, because he was their priority at the time. They all ran at once to join the rest of their warriors, with the boiling anger in them, having seen a great warrior die just like that. They fought to survive the war, to take over their land, and to avenge the instant death of one of them. After about 2 minutes of their continual attack at their opponent, tables turned and they started having the winning edge over them. It was as though a strange atmosphere took over their opponent and made them all less strong than they were. Omuaran warriors noticed this too, but they had no time to give that a thought or start to notice that for too long. They only saw that as an advantage and assumed that the gods had seen them losing and wanted to help them. So they took their weakness as a sign of assistance from the gods to win the battle. Soon, they killed a lot of their opponents' warriors and watched others flee away from them. They then started enchanting songs of victory as they marched back to the village. The king, King Deja, rode on his royal horse, which was the biggest and finest amongst the horses they all rode to the battlefield. He joined them in singing the songs of victory they were singing, and he seemed to have known all the songs in accordance to how they sang it. As they entered the village square, people came out of their huts and jubilated with the king and his warriors upon their triumphant retrieval of the land that had always been theirs since they all became of age. They followed them straight to the palace. They would have loved to dance around the village, but they couldn't because of the king's involvement. They were warmly welcomed at the palace. The king ordered that they all be fed, both the well-wishers and the warriors. It was indeed a remarkable day in the history of kingship, and in particular King Deja's record. They ate and drank till it was late in the night. Then they all left the palace for their houses to sleep. They needn't cook anymore because they already ate more than enough at the palace. The news of King Deja's participatory in the just concluded victorious war spread round Omuaran and its environs, and this made people love him more. He gained his people's trust in no time and intended to keep it that way because he needed the people to continue talking about him for good anywhere they traveled to. He needed the good record to be termed great when he finally goes to join his ancestors. He was happy everything was going on very well in the village. His queen was also months pregnant and even brought more joy to his heart. He was going to be a father at 41, so he wanted to make the village atmosphere a good one for his child to land and live in. He ruled the affairs of the village freely and fairly. He was praised and loved by the gods for this, so they blessed him with a male child. The child was christened named as tradition demanded, and everybody went about doing their normal thing. Everything was fine for so long a time, until King Deja incurred the wrath of the gods upon he and his people.
It happened that they were planning to go to the next 3 villages to capture and make them slaves in Omuaran Palace. They needed more hands on the palace farm and felt Egata, the small kingdom they were planning to enslave, was going to do a great job if their lives depended on it. Not that they were too lazy to get the job done by themselves, but they wanted to make use of their power and prowess over these people. King Deja couldn't bear to see his own people slaving for him on the farm. He rather wanted some unknown individual to do that. He planned with the warriors silently, without even informing the village chiefs who were supposed to be closest to the king. They couldn't afford to have the information leak out to the people to avoid disrupting anything. They wanted to take them unawares by the end of that week, so that they would catch them off guard. The king and his warriors had already visited the chief priest at the shrine to fortify themselves in preparation for the capturing.
They ate all that needed to be eaten and drank everything they were as instructed by the gods through the chief priest. All they did after that was wait for the appointed day and pray for the capturing to be a success. Large number of Omuaran warriors visited a friend they all considered so close to the warriors' chief, Balogun, and decided to take their time to eat and drink what they were offered. Unknowing to them, their so-called friend had chipped Agata people that they were going to be captured soon. Only the gods know how he was able to get that information. His friend must have spilled it out during one of their talking sessions. Agata Kingdom devised a plan to abort Omuaran mission on getting that information. One of them disguised a wanted friend who just wanted to dine with the warriors for the love of their work. He put some diabolical, forbidden powdered substance inside their food and drinks and watched them take it in. They drank to stupor and were also given strange women home to lay with. They laid with them and only got to know of this when their eyes became clear the following day. They came back to their senses, regretted their actions, and had to hurriedly report themselves to Balogun. Balogun took off to the palace almost immediately he got to know of this, because they had no time to waste. The scheduled date for the capturing was just around the corner, and they needed to do something about it. The chief priest had earlier warned them against laying with any woman until they were back from the assignment they were being prepared for. So it was going to be a little tough washing off the things they took in and taking back what the maidens had taken away from them when they lay with them. If they didn't take immediate actions, the substance could kill them all and their powers permanently taken from them. So the Balagun had to swing into action with immediate effect. The king was shocked hearing this. He became perplexed and sad on hearing this. He then sent for the chief priest to come consult the gods before them to see if there was a remedy for this. He prayed there was solution to all these, even as he thought of making a recruit of warriors. But even if he recruited new warriors, they were not going to meet up with the planned capturing. The Egata people really got them this time. They were really underestimated. The chief priest arrived and the consultation began. He did that for some minutes and communicated with the gods in an unknown language. After 30 minutes of conversing with the gods, he finally said something. He said the gods demanded that they sacrifice 7 virgins for their refortification and purification. They were shocked to hear what the gods had demanded of them and didn't know how to get 7 virgins in 24 hours. They only had 24 hours for any preparation they wanted to do. The chief priest left and they began to think of possible ways to get 7 virgins in 24 hours for the refortification and purification of their warriors.
The king pondered on the issue all night, as he didn't know how to get the requested number of virgins before the next night, if they were going to go with the war as planned. He thought of sending some palace guards to the village boundaries to capture any maiden they saw passing. He discarded the thought because they might end up taking some of Omuaran's citizens. He thought of enticing them with money because he was rich and had affluence. He cancelled that thought when he realized a lot of brooding is required for anyone to concede to such. He reminded himself of the need for anyone who would do such to consult their relatives for consent and agreement. So he decided to go with his second option. But that would mean that the fixed date for the battle and capturing would be postponed. So he consoled himself and reassured himself of the high rate of success they would get if they fought their battles after the sacrifice, no matter how long it would take to get all they needed for the sacrifice. The following morning, King Deja called the town crier to go round the village, announcing the urgent need for 7 virgin maidens who would lay down their lives for the progress of the kingdom, and the heavy prices attached to it. He told the town crier he was going to share half of his wealth among the 7 maidens' family and make sure they never lacked anything good till they die. The town crier rose immediately and left King Deja's presence to deliver the message to circulate round the whole village. He went to every nook and cranny of Omuaran kingdom. By the time it was known, he had already finished delivering the message sent him by the king. So he headed back to the palace to give the king feedback. King Deja, knowing they wouldn't be able to get all complete 7 maidens at once, and certainly not within the space of 2 hours, called the warriors and their chief, Balogun, to the palace, shared what he had done that early morning, and how they would need to postpone the day slated for the war/capturing to take place, and for them to come back to the village in one piece. They agreed and had no objection whatsoever, probably because he was king. The day continues to count, with no trace of any maiden coming to surrender themselves for the sacrifice. Everybody started getting worried. They are liable to be defeated should anyone try challenging them to war. Their warriors were as ordinary as their housewives, so they needed the cleansing urgently, even if they were not going to go for a Gata capturing again.
The king called the chief priest and asked if there could be something else done to replace the killing of the 7 virgins. He sighed and told the king that the only other remedy to what they've done was to lose their manhood. The king shouted, "What? How can that be the only remedy left as an option for them?" The chief priest smiled and told the king that the substance put inside the warriors' food was very powerful. They made sure of that to render them powerless instantly, which was successful anyways. King Deja then took his mind off getting another option to solving their problems. He focused on getting the 7 virgins as soon as 7 days before the next market day. He sensed the news of their warriors being nothing, and the gods getting angry at them must have flown to the neighboring kingdoms, and they could leverage on this to attack them on the next market day. He prayed the gods directed some maidens to him for the sacrifice. He thought of asking the hunters to bring any stranger they saw at the border of their kingdom to him for the sacrifice. But the sacrifice was one of its kind, which has to be voluntary because of the kind of maidens involved in it. The announcement of the needed 7 virgins for sacrifice to the gods continued to linger in the mouth of the people, as it was now the subject for discussion everywhere women were gathered in Omuaran kingdom. The king called a meeting and reminded the village heads and his chiefs that they all had just 6 days to get the sacrifice ready and have their warriors back in track, or else they would be doomed. While they were at the meeting, a palace guard walked in and informed the king that a maiden was outside, waiting to see him. He signaled the guard, asking him to bring whoever that was outside inside. The guard stood up and ran off to bring the guest in without any further delay.
The maiden walked into the palace as led by the palace guard, looking so scared and curious to know where the king was. She stopped at a point and asked the guard if she could wait there for the king, but the palace guard insisted on taking her further inside the king's living room, where he was instructed to bring her to. The maiden followed him without any further questions, but was still thinking of why the palace living room was that far from the entrance. She imagined being the builder of the palace and said to herself that she wouldn't waste so much space for the hallway of a house. After some minutes she had been following the palace guard, they finally got to where the king was. "Greetings, my king," she said as she knelt down to greet the king. The king responded to her greetings and asked what brought her to the palace. She couldn't beat about the bush because she feared that she had just interrupted the king's meeting with his people, so she spilled the beans. "My king, I have come to surrender myself as a sacrificial lamb for the kingdom to get back her peace. I would be glad if I'm accepted as one of the 7 virgin maidens that was announced to be needed for the urgent sacrifice." The king was overwhelmed to hear this, as that would be the first maiden to appear at the palace following the announcement the town crier had made days before then. He immediately asked her to stand up and smile to his people that was a good sign they'd soon complete the number of virgins they were looking for. She was immediately taken to the backyard of the palace for goodies to be given to her for her family. This was not part of the earlier announced prize. It was just to show how serious the kingdom was about finding maidens for the sacrifice. She collected the goodies and went home in peace. The maiden in question was from a very poor family. No one had ever been rich in her generation. She wanted to sacrifice herself for the entire family and rest knowing that she being sacrificed to the gods on behalf of the kingdom would forever turn things around for her family. Walking through the streets of Omuaran kingdom to her house, people saw the gifts she had with her and started gossiping of how serious the king was about the announcement from the palace. They had great pity on the lady for taking such a bold step and wished for such not to befall them. Following the appearance of the maiden in the palace, 6 other maidens appeared in the palace for the same cause. They claimed to have been very poor and was at the palace for the same reason as the first maiden who showed up there. News got to the king in the palace and nothing seemed to be enough to quantify his joy. He was so happy that he sent a message to the chief priest immediately he received the news from the guards, even before he stepped outside to see these maidens. He told the messenger to tell the chief priest that the materials for the sacrifice was now complete and that the chief priest should prepare at his end for it to take place immediately. They were going to meet up at an unusual T-junction near the village square. He also sent another guard to get the warriors to assemble at the palace and to tell the Balogun to start preparing for his warrior's sacrifice. After he got that settled, he went in to change his clothes because he believed he was going to go out after seeing those maidens. He saw no need for going back inside his chambers to have a change of clothes after meeting them. He did all he had to do and finally came out to see the maidens.
He smiled as he sighted them from afar while walking down the stairs outside to meet them. When he got closer to them, his mood changed. He frowned his face and demanded that one of those maidens follow him immediately. He had noticed one of them was not a virgin because he had once forcefully lied with her during one of his trips to his farm before he became king. He knew her and still recognized her so well, even after so many years had passed by. He wasn't going to allow her join the maidens to march down to the chief priest and have him disgraced publicly. He wanted to see her privately to ask why she claimed to be a virgin when she knew quite well that she wasn't. She followed the king just as he commanded. No one dares disobey the king's order, not even his wife. King Deja recounted the ordeal he had with her and how he begged her to forgive and forget. Then he asked why the maiden showed her face again at the palace when she knew they needed only virgin maidens. She eyed him rudely and said she only wanted to do that for her family. She said that was her family's only chance of getting rich in Omuaran kingdom. She told him that her family had requested this from her because they thought she was still a virgin. They assured her that she would be remembered for this from generation to generation. She had no option but to be at the palace for the sacrifice. She threatened to expose King Deja should he try to tell anyone she wasn't a virgin, and that he also had to make sure she was confirmed virgin by the chief priest.
King Deja at this point knew he was in trouble, and no one would be able to save him. He knew he would be doomed should anyone discover this from the maiden. He had no choice but to dance to the maiden's tune and do her bidding. He asked her to leave his presence at 1. After being dumbfounded the whole time, the maiden was talking. He was literally sweating in a place that had good air circulating round the whole place. His crown became suddenly too hot on his head. He removed it and started thinking of how he was going to convince his people of his innocence and blackmail. He thought of how he was supposed to explain to the people that he was just young and naive when he did that. He thought of confiding in the chief priest and telling him to help him out. He cancelled that thought when he remembered the virginity confirmation was going to be done in the presence of so many people. He stood up from his throne and sat on the sofa next to him. He needed to come up with a quick solution because he had sent words earlier to everyone involved in the sacrifice. He then remembered the chief priest was in dire need of money. He wanted to use it to renovate the cracking wall of his house before it fell completely. He picked up his crown where he had placed it some minutes before that time, wore it and dashed so fast outside. He managed to tell the maidens outside that he would soon be back for them, as he had his driver drive him off so fast. He was heading to the shrine to silence the chief priest with money before anyone would get to him. He wanted to see the chief priest privately and beg him to maneuver the virginity confirmation of one of those maidens. He told him he had to do that to cover his shame and protect the name he had worked so hard to build for himself. The chief priest agreed to his request after a little time of going back and forth. He didn't know what the king had done to make him resort to begging him for manipulations, but felt that was his only chance of demanding for the exact amount of money he needed if he was going to renovate his house in no time. He listened to King Deja's plea and changed the real means he wanted to use to confirm the maiden's virginity.
The 6 maidens were brought to the shrine for virginity confirmation before heading to the T-junction for the sacrifice proper. The other maiden who came first had been tested and confirmed, so she didn't need to go for the confirmation with the other maidens. Just before the virginity confirmation began, the chief priest had sounded a note of warning to the maidens to confess their true virginity status before being tested. He said if the result came out negative, that they wouldn't be spared at all, as they would be instantly imprisoned by the palace guards. Tobi, the maiden that was forcefully laid with by the king, looked at the Balogun, his warriors, and every other person present there, started shivering as she didn't know if the king had earlier made plans for her with the chief priest or not. She made an attempt to raise her hands to confess she was no longer a virgin and what had led to that, but she braved up after looking at the king, who signaled her that she should be calm. The chief priest didn't see anyone raise their hand to confess. Besides, it was just for formality, so he continued with what he wanted to do. All through the process, Tobiz was not at rest, as she wasn't too sure the gods would cooperate with the chief priest in maneuvering the result of that test. But what she didn't know was that the chief priest didn't, in the real sense, involve the gods in that process. It was just all for formality. In no time, the chief priest was done with the virginity confirmation, and none of them was proclaimed not a virgin. They then proceeded to the T-junction together with the maiden who showed up first in the palace and some passers-by. They had the maidens tie white wrapper as a symbol of purity and carried pots on their heads to make sure each warrior bathed with that water after the maidens must have been slaughtered by the shrine butcher. They all passed the fastest route to this junction, moving on a file one after the other, and got there in no time. The chief priest asked the maidens to kneel on a file facing the big tree at this junction, and they did. Families and friends present there shed tears as their beloved young potential mothers were about to be offered as sacrifice to the gods, without leaving a piece of them behind. Women cried in a loud voice and children watched innocently. Fathers put their hands underneath their chin looking sad, as they couldn't cry because men were known to be the braver gender. They stood forming a parallel line, leaving the sacrifice to be performed in the middle. A calabash was brought out to collect an amount of water from the maiden's pot and make it go round their heads 3 times, while the chief priest muttered some indistinct words to communicate with the gods. After he had said a lot of incantations and the warriors giving some marks in their bodies, the shrine butcher was called upon to come spill the blood of the maidens on Omuaran land and warriors. I stood by the king as his guard that I was, and I watched these maidens being killed for sacrifice. I couldn't hold my tears from dripping down my cheeks. I was supposed to be strong for everyone being a guard, but I wasn't. I prayed silently in my heart that the sacrifice be accepted by the gods, so that the death of the virgin maidens wouldn't be in vain.
The whole kingdom had mixed feelings about the just offered sacrifice. They didn't know whether to rejoice over the fact that they now had their warriors back for their defense, or they should be sad for the massive loss of humans' life they just had in the land. For 2 market days, women were not their usual selves, as they tried to observe mourning days for the family who had their maidens offered as sacrifice to the gods. They were very quiet and didn't go to visit themselves. They stayed indoors most of the time, and that made the whole kingdom look strange. The streets were so dry, even their pets didn't get much to eat outside their owners' homes. Children were not allowed to go out, as they were grounded from going anywhere outside their father's compound. At the end of the 2 market days, the villagers all marched to the palace to be a witness to the division of half the king's property amongst the families of the sacrificed virgin maidens. They wanted to make sure these families collected what they deserved as promised by the king. They got to the palace and called for the attention of the king. King Deja had already known the reason the people had called him out, so he had made prepare the properties he wanted to share amongst these people. The last thing he wanted would be to fail on his promise to the families of the deceased. He called one of his chiefs, who happened to be his right-hand man, to come witness the sharing of the properties. He arrived at the palace some minutes after he was called upon, and the king attended to the people outside his palace immediately. He shared his promised properties equally amongst them and left them with smiles on their faces. Finally, the women could get back to their normal works and live to remember the sacrifices of these virgin maidens. Since the coast was already clear enough for the warriors to pick up their swords and go for any battle that came their way, they decided to make a proposal to the king to revisit their abandoned plan to go capture the people of Egata Kingdom for the work on the palace's farm. They gathered themselves together with their leader Balogun, marched down to the palace, and tendered their agreed discussion to the king. King Deja was skeptical about them going for any battle. He wasn't too sure they would come back safe this time. He knew the manipulations that took place between himself and the chief priest, so he had already concluded in his heart that the sacrifice was not accepted and the warriors not yet fit to go for war. But he couldn't just rule out their proposal, so he told them he would think about it and get back to them later. He wanted time to himself to be able to ask the chief priest if the sacrifice was accepted at all. He also wanted to know if the warriors would not lose their lives in the process. Although he was 100% sure that the sacrifice wasn't accepted, but he still wanted to hear from the horse's mouth. So he sent for the chief priest to leave whatever he was doing to come see him in the palace. The messenger left and was back in no time. He said the chief priest wasn't on seat and that he had traveled some days before he got there. He said he left the message for his son who he met at the shrine, and he assured him he would have the message delivered to the chief priest.
3 days later, the chief priest went to the palace to see the king immediately he got back from his trip, as requested. He had known what the king wanted to discuss with him, so he demanded to see the king in his chambers. He was allowed in since he was the kingdom's chief priest and he had never made such request before. He knocked and silently entered. King Deja was surprised to see him, as he wasn't aware he had got back from his trip. He sat him down and told him his fears about what the warriors had discussed with him days back. He further asked him if the last sacrifice they offered for the warriors' refortification and purification was truly accepted by the gods. The chief priest sighed and bowed his head in deep thought. He then explained to the king that the gods never accepted the sacrifice as they were not given all they requested for. He said they've spoken to him about the unfaithfulness and maneuvering he did with the king during the sacrifice, and they were very angry at him. He said the trip he embarked on days before then was because the gods were no longer communicating with him. They got pissed and gave him that as his punishment for taking the king's bribe. King Deja was shocked to hear this. He became so perplexed as he didn't know what punishment the gods had in store for him too. He believed the gods could do worse to him, considering he was not the closest person to them and the orchestrator of the whole thing. The chief priest advised the king to stop them from getting involved in any war, as they would all soon start struggling with their lives. The substance they took was still in them and would in no time wipe out the 2/3 of warriors that still had it in them. He suggested he told them himself, seeing that they always believed every word that came out of the chief priest's mouth. He wanted to tell them as if it were the gods who instructed him to pass the message to them. But King Deja said no. He was afraid the news of Omuaran's warrior being weak would fly out to the neighboring village again, and they would use that against him and his people. He also didn't want the villagers to start thinking he wasn't fit enough to become king, saying that he'd been battling with the same problem for 2 months. He then concluded he would allow them go to war against the Egata people, but he wouldn't follow them. He also had it in mind to announce the recruit of new warriors, so that the strong men who would want to benefit from the war proceeds would join the kingdom warriors. This was what he said. He said running the affairs of the kingdom few months to that time had taken a toll on him, and he didn't want to push himself to go for a war he wasn't prepared for. Considering his past record, it was easy to convince the warriors and Omuaran people that their king was just not fit to go to war. If only they had known the real reason the king decided to stay back this time, they would have also stayed back and waited for their prolonged, untimely death. They would at least have had the time to settle things and bid their families farewell before the substance they still had in them took their lives. But they didn't know. Hence, their eagerness to go and capture the Egata people. They got ready and headed for Egata Kingdom in no time. The warriors going without planning for a long period of time would have been a good strategy to catch them unawares, and the capturing made easy by the unpreparedness of Egata warriors. But that wasn't the case, because the gods had left them and they were now vulnerable to attacks.
Even their littlest enemies, who were probably not as strong as they were, would have overcome them should they fight against them. The Omuaran warriors boldly sojourned to Egata kingdom, holding their guns and machetes, unknowing to them that they were as empty as barrel. They attacked first and were taking hold of the whole kingdom until their organs started to malfunction and they could not as much as lift a finger by themselves anymore. They became so weak that their enemies noticed this, rose against them, and had it in mind to capture and enslave them too. But the warriors began to die by themselves even before they could think of fighting them any further. A lot of the warriors slumped and died. The only ones left were the ones that didn't partake in the dinner that led to their easy attack. They ran as fast as their legs could and went as far as their legs could take them until they got far away from Egata kingdom. The villagers and warriors were surprised at how the war turned out to be in their favor and thought it was their gods who helped them overcome the war. They have earlier heard of the sacrifice performed by the Omuaran warriors for their cleansing, so they didn't think what they had taken was still affecting them even while they were at war them.
The whole kingdom of Omuaran were sad as that would the first time of losing so many warriors to war. They were surprised they could lose that much warrior to a kingdom considered to be the smallest of all kingdoms around them. Some people rightly guessed that the gods were angry at them, while others said they lost to a Egeta kingdom because the king didn't follow them to that war. They believed that the king had the favor of the gods upon him, and they would have all been saved from death if the king had followed them. Things continued to deteriorate for the people of Omuaran. They no longer reaped bountiful harvest. They had problems going out of the village as they were usually attacked by strange figures. The youth easily died at the slightest illness they had. They no longer felt the hand of the gods in their lives, farm proceeds and daily activities. All these were still ongoing when King Deja went ahead to make an announcement that he had found the love of his life, whom he wanted to make his third wife. He had married a maiden given to him by the village head hunter, all in the bid to appreciate the king for helping the hunter out with their hunting by equipping them and showing interest in what they did. He accepted the maiden without hesitation and saw marrying her as acquiring another sexual asset. He had her things packed to the palace immediately she was handed to him, few months before trouble loomed the kingdom. He was going to marry another maiden again, and this time a non-indigene. He had met that maiden on one of evening strolls round the village while the warriors were at war against the Egata kingdom. He saw her and was attracted to her beauty. The maiden was indeed beautiful, but wasn't looking ordinary to myself and the whole village. I guess the only one that didn't see this, or rather refused to see this, was King Deja. He was carried away by her incomparable beauty and immediately approached her for marriage. The maiden was also swept off her feet by the handsomeness of the king. She was not a native of Omuaran kingdom, so she had never seen a king that young and handsome. She was so drawn to the king and could think of nothing else but accepting the king's marriage proposal. She accepted to marry the king almost immediately he asked her to, and that made the king so happy that he didn't even see it as improper to announce his marriage to some maiden from elsewhere at that critical moment. King Deja invited his chiefs and told them about his plans to marry Ewan, his queen-to-be, and asked them to go to Ewa's place to do the needful. He said they should go pay her bride price, assist her in packing her things, and lead her down to the palace for the completion of the marriage ritual. The chiefs couldn't object the king's desire because they had no voice when it comes to telling the king what to do and what not to do. The chiefs obeyed and did as the king had instructed them. They went to see Ewa's people with all that was required to pay her bride price. They went with the king's staff of authority, which was to represent the king's presence and awareness. They didn't meet Ewa's mother at home when they got there, but they met her sister, who had been doing a lot of things for Ewa in the absence of her mother. Ewa's mother was not always at home to take care of her child like a mother should because of the nature of her job. The woman who served as Ewa's mother gave the chiefs a warm welcome together with a couple of uncles from their side. They accepted all the chiefs had brought along with them and gave Ewa to them as the new bride of the king. They ate, drank, and appreciated their new in-laws as they left with Ewa and the guards carrying all her belongings for her.
King Deja seemed to be the only happy person in the entire kingdom, as he lived his life to the fullest with his new bride. He seemed not bothered about the recent happenings in Omuaran kingdom. People wondered if their king was the same good man, so they thought, the gods picked as their king. They worried so much for the king as he had changed a lot, and they know sooner than later the gods of the land would visit him with annoyance. They watched the king run his life and that of the kingdom as he so pleased. They knew the gods were not blind to all that was happening, neither were they deaf to the merriment going on in the palace on a daily basis, despite the kingdom's condition at the time. The new queen, Queen Ewa, paraded herself round the kingdom every now and then because she felt she was now the talk of the town and the face of the kingdom. King Deja allowed her do whatever she wanted to do and gave her everything she requested because of the love he had for her. That would actually be the first time a maiden willingly married him without being coerced into marriage with him or being gifted to him. So he was still not over the enthusiasm love brings to anyone who is newly in love. He made her his legal official queen, who would go with him to occasions outside Omuaran and do all that needed to be done by the king's wife. The other wives contested this decision, but their voices didn't go past their bedrooms, as the king was liable to punish them or send them packing if he heard them contesting his decision. The whole kingdom concluded that King Deja was bewitched by the strange woman he got married to, and prayed that he sends her back to her people soon. The happiness of marrying a beauty queen began to diminish when a very strange seasonal illness set in for the king. He would always fall sick every 5 market days and get back to his feet 2 weeks later. Whenever he was ill, everyone would think that was the time for him to die, only for him to get back to his feet again days later. There became an urgent need for the gods to be consulted as to why the king was always that ill, even though the king knew he was being punished for the offense he committed together with the chief priest. The gods could have easily forgiven him, just like they did when he raped the innocent girl, if he had confessed publicly and taken responsibilities for his actions, but he didn't. Hence, the wrath of the gods descending upon him for belittling them and thinking of them as blind not to see all he did. King Deja became worried and started thinking that was the end of the road for him. He nonetheless sought to seek the chief priest who had still not redeemed himself from his crimes against the gods. The chief priest answered the king for show off, but they both knew what the problem was. The chief priest promised the king he would invite a foreign seer, who was the eye of the gods, and send him to the palace to see the king. He was glad to hear this, so he immediately asked the chief priest to go for the invite at once before nightfall.
Just as the chief priest had promised, he sent a diviner and seer to the palace the following day, and he consulted his oracles for the problems King Deja was facing. He then delivered the god's message when he said nothing could be done to cure the king's illness, and that the gods were angry at him for maneuvering the last sacrifice that took the lives of so many. He further told him his little secret, the one he had with the offended maiden. But he was the only one who heard this because no one was there with them at the king's chambers. He discharged his visitor, handed him some gift he had his guards prepare for him, and watched him leave. The rumor of the king's strange illness circulated the whole kingdom in no time. Only the gods know who always shared palace information with the villagers. They resumed their gossip stations every morning and would always discuss the probability of the king's new queen having a hand in the king's strange seasonal illness. They started to proffer solutions to this illness, asking the king to divorce that queen or make her pay seriously in his own way. Only if the king heard all they discussed, maybe he would have considered doing any one of them. King Deja became a shadow of himself as he was no longer the happy man he used to be. He decided to confide in his dearest newest queen to tell her about his illness, who was behind it, and how the gods wouldn't stop until he either confessed or died. He called Queen Ewa and explained everything to her, from the genesis of his problems to the part where he was now enjoying the consequences of his actions. He begged her to help him think of any plausible solution to solve his problems, possibly a unique way of appeasing their gods, seeing that their gods were almost the greatest of all other gods in the kingdoms around them. He believed he wouldn't be able to get help from any other god apart from their own gods, so he just wanted to appease them so that they would overlook his shortcomings and forgive him. But the response he got from his queen shocked him.
Queen Ewa sighed and told him she would help him find solution to his illness. She explained that she was from the lineage of priestesses. She said her mom was a direct descendant of a priestess, so she would travel home to make sure she found a lasting solution to his illness. On hearing this, King Deja rose to his feet and went inside his room, as he didn't know how exactly he was to react to the shocking information his queen had just shared with him. He got inside his room and started brooding over all the queen had said. Following these, Queen Ewa packed little luggage and left the palace to find her mom and ask for her help, but the whole kingdom thought she had been driven away by the king. They gathered in twos and threes and discussed the successful exit of the queen from their kingdom. They didn't know she only went on a mission. Even the other palace wives were not aware of her mission. Her absence was greatly felt by the king. We all prayed in our hearts that the king wouldn't fall ill again before the return of the queen, because we were so sure he wouldn't make it back to life should the sickness take charge of his body again. After 10 days of Queen Ewa's absence from the palace, she returned with good news for the king. She had pestered her mother and made sure she found a lasting solution to the king's illness. They made several sacrifices to the gods and had Ewa's mother stand as an advocator for the appeasing of the gods. They made a concoction for the king to eat to become very healthy, and it was given to Queen Ewa to make sure he ate it rightly. When she gave it to the king together with explanations of how it was done and instructions of how he would eat it, the king was shocked and at the same time glad he found a savior in his beloved queen. He ate it as instructed and he started getting better hours later. Weeks later, Queen Ewa's mother thought it wise to visit her daughter and her husband, whom she had gone through a lot to prepare a healing concoction for. She didn't inform her daughter of her visit, so Queen Ewa, as well as everyone in the palace, wasn't aware of the visit prior to that time. She had entered Omuaran kingdom looking strange and funny, as a priestess would. Everybody feared another trouble had risen again, and it was just a matter of time before they got called by the king to the palace. They gave her directions to the palace as she had requested of them. As she got into the compound of the palace, the king also came out of his room into the sitting room with his beloved queen. They were chatting when Ewa's mother walked inside to meet them as directed by the palace maids. Her luggage had been collected from her into the palace, even as the maid with her luggage intended to inform the queen and king of their mother's arrival, because that was who she called herself at the gate. She was happy when she saw her daughter coming to welcome her. Immediately, she was informed of her presence. Ewa expressed her unpreparedness to receive her as an important guest that she was, and she led her straight to the king, her darling husband. Queen Ewa's mother fainted at the sight of the king. At first, King Deja didn't know why his mother-in-law had fainted on getting to where he was seated. But later, when he had a closer look at the woman, he knew he was also doomed too. Just that his reason for thinking that way was different from the reason Ewa's mother had fainted. When she finally came back to consciousness, she explained her ordeal with the king. She said King Deja had once laid with her during one of his trips to her shrine in his quest for power. He was meant to use that as a password to getting affiliated to her source of power as permitted by her gods. But he ran away afterwards thinking that he had it all already. He wasn't aware of the fact that he was supposed to wait back for the perfection of the whole power acquisition process. Strangely, she took in and couldn't abort the pregnancy because that was her chance of ever having a child in her life. She took it that she had found favor from her gods and gave birth to the child, after which she handed her over to her sister since she couldn't take care of the child while working with or for her gods. King Deja's own reason for thinking he was doomed was because he thought he had slept with mother and child and would be needing some sort of cleansing to avert the repercussion, unknown to him that his offense was more grievous than he thought. He never knew he had a daughter with the priestess, let alone know that he would marry her by mistake. Now he started thinking of how his life as a king would just end like that. He thought of how the gods had favored and picked him as an ordinary farmer to become a king of great Omuaran kingdom. He thought of how he wanted to spend so many more years on the throne to at least give birth to more children.
He thought of all his escapades as a king and started crying after realizing it was only a matter of time before the right action was taken by the chiefs to serve him his punishment. He stood up from their midst, picked up his horse tail, and went inside his room for the very last time.